Go ahead, Ahmad.
Aloha and welcome, Boma, Hawaii members and guests to our April learning, sorry, to our April Lunch and Learn program. My name is Ahmad Pajwar and I'm Director of Building Operations at Kahalanui and also a member of Board of Directors at Boma, Hawaii. Before we go on with our program, I would like to take a couple of minutes to thank our today's sponsor, Premier Restoration Hawaii. Thank you so much for sponsoring today's, and also having speakers from Premier Hawaii presenting. Before, again, like what I said, before I go on, I gotta take care of a couple of things. So Boma Hawaii members will receive a Grubhub e-gift card for their meal. And you can be on the lookout in your email for that. I already got mine this morning. Thank you guys. Our speakers have been gracious enough to stay around to answer some of the questions at the end. So the way you can ask questions, please type in your questions in the chat box and we will attend to them at the end. So let's get down to the business. The topic of today's program is how building managers should prepare for disasters. Our first speaker is Sue Savio, President and owner of Insurance Associates Incorporated. Sue Savio has been President and owner of Insurance Associates Inc. since 1975. She is past President of Hawaii Independent Insurance Agents Association and Community Association Institute, also known as CAI, and has served on the board in different capacities since 2000. She was recently honored with the Garley Award for Distinguished Services to CAI Hawaii and currently serves on the boards of 3 condo associations. You can tell she seems like she's a very busy lady. Welcome, Sue. Our next speaker is Anthony Nelson, President of Premier Restoration Hawaii. Premier Restoration Hawaii is a full-service mitigation and restoration company providing a one-stop solution for water, fire, mold, and wind damage to the residential and commercial properties. He joined the company in 2009 as an estimator and was promoted to operations manager within a year. In his role, he aggressively grew the company from 8 to 55 employees by 2016. When he was promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations, Anthony unified PRH's 150 plus employees across company's 4 different island locations: Oahu, Maui, Hawaii Island, and Kauai, as one cohesive team. This kind of reminds me of a king that we used to do. I mean, we have Kamehameha basically did the same thing. Good job, Anthony. Without further ado, please welcome Sue and Anthony. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking today about insurance issues after the disaster and is it too late? And I've been in this insurance business for 45 years, as discussed, since 1975. And it amazes me how many people today, after the disaster, say, I didn't understand that, I didn't have the right limits, what do I do now? So we're going to kind of talk about what happens after the disaster and what you can do. And I don't care whether you manage a hotel, a strip mall, a shopping center, a condo, your own business, you all need some form of insurance to transfer the risk that you're all taking. For most of us, we understand the property side. Okay, it's not a problem. We understand that there's a fire, we're going to deal with it. But what we don't understand many times is what happens beyond that fire. And what happens when it's not a fire that we're worried about, but it is a hurricane. okay? And versus wind. On your property policy, along with your fire, is wind coverage. So if it's wind, you are protected, all right? But the minute it turns into a storm that is named, it's now a hurricane, and it's a whole nother animal. So you really need to understand that your everyday property policy probably does not have hurricane on it. Some will, some companies do offer it, others don't. So you want to make sure that you have both covered, because yes, we haven't had hurricanes in a while, but it doesn't mean we're not going to. All right. So that's the biggest problem there, understanding the difference. And what is that difference? A hurricane is when a storm system's been declared and defined by the Central Pacific Hurricane Center of the National Weather Service. It's not just somebody saying it's a hurricane. It has to be defined. It has to include the time at each island that it hits each island in our state. So maybe it's not a hurricane when it's at Kauai, it has some windstorm, or Oahu, but it becomes a hurricane at some point. And when it does, your other deductible takes over, not the standard $5,000 or whatever deductible you have on your fire policy. Okay, so it begins at the time of a hurricane watch. Okay, it continues through the hurricane conditions exist in our island up to 72 hours after it's been declared a hurricane. Okay, so during that time, all that damage is hurricane damage and not covered most likely by your property policy. So you've got to understand, well, okay, so what's the difference? I have hurricane coverage, I'm okay. You are okay, but the difference is for commercial clients, you usually have a 2% of the building value, not 2% of the loss. But if your building's insured for 30 million, 100 million, 10 million, 5 million, it's 2% of that building value. That is your deductible. It's a huge deductible for most of us, okay? And it's something you have to plan on how you're going to handle it. What are you going to do with this deductible when it hits? Are you saving money for it? Who saves money? We're in Hawaii. We're barely making it most of the time. Or we have COVID hit and we don't have any extra money because it's all gone. But you've got to figure out what's going to happen. Take a look at these pictures from Iniki, okay? For homeowners, and we all are homeowners, hopefully, whether we own a condo or a house, our deductible is usually $1,000. So it's much more affordable. But usually it's also a separate policy, even if you do happen to be able to own a home. The other peril nobody knows much about, and it usually doesn't happen in Hawaii, and I was born and raised here, but we did have many hail claims. And we've never had hail until a couple of years ago. And it's quite devastating, and it did cause a lot of damage. Hail is standard like your property policy deductible. So it's the standard deductible on your property policy. But hail does cause a lot of damage, and it's covered under both your homeowners and your commercial policy. Tsunamis. This is another thing we don't think about. We don't ever want to have it to happen to us. But flood is not covered on any other policy than your flood policy. Your hurricane policy does not cover the flood damage. When Iniki hit, there was a lot of flood damage, and that water line down is flood damage. The wind damage is above that water line. So people who carry a hurricane policy do not have coverage for the flood that comes with it. You would have to have a separate flood policy. As business owners, if you're in a mandated flood zone, or you're in a zone near where there's going to be flooding, you would want to have a flood policy. We know what just happened recently out in Aina and Hawaii Kai and all those areas with flooding. What happened out in Haleiwa, those people don't have policies. They're homeowners or they're small businesses. They just don't anticipate that rain and all the water coming down from the mountain is going to possibly create a problem. And that's what happened in both of those instances, Aina and Haleiwa. So anyway, the average flood claim, according to the National Flood Policy Program, is nearly $30,000, okay? And the cost is usually $625 a year to have a flood policy. It's something you need to consider. Am I in an area that's going to be a problem? Am I fine? My home is elevated, my business is elevated, or am I a business on the first floor in Waikiki where there could be a flood, or on the Alawai where there could be a flood, where we've had floods, okay? So that's something you have to consider when you're talking about the risk of your business. So only a flood policy covers flood, not your homeowners, not your property policy. And when the hurricane brings the flood, you've got hurricane coverage maybe, but you don't have flood if you don't have a flood policy. So keep that in mind. Next is state of Hawaii decided that we have some extreme tsunami zones. Just recently, they went ahead and redid a whole bunch of areas, which we always thought as flood areas. They now decided that there's going to be some different areas that they want to put into a flood zone, and they're calling it extreme tsunami area. It's not impacted as far as costs because you're not forced to buy a policy there. Like if you have a mortgage, your mortgage company forces you to buy a flood policy if you're in a mandated flood zone. But the problem is, if you look at this map, understanding that this pink line here is the Alawai, and all the pink was what was considered flood zones in Waikiki. Now you've got all this yellow. They're now saying these are the extreme evacuation and tsunami zones. So it's going all the way up into the Makiki area and things of that sort. There's a lot of condos, there's a lot of businesses, okay? So it's not just Alawai down now. It's this whole area that could be a problem if there is for flooding. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes. But right now, these are different areas that the city feels, the state feels are going to be problems if we have a tsunami. And let's be honest, many of us way back in here, we don't even think about it, right? Oh, I'm way far away from the water. It's not going to hurt me. Well, it may. Okay, we just don't know. So before the emergency hits, I always tell people you have to pre-plan. You have to try to minimize any adverse effects of an emergency. Okay, I mean, we all, hurricane season, people put their water in the canned goods and they're all ready. And they kept their cash because the banks are closed and you can't use the machines because they don't have no electricity. Okay, that happened in Kauai. We all know how to handle it now. Okay, but what about our businesses? You know, I'm in the insurance business. When the hurricane hits, everybody's expecting to get hold of me because they need to file a claim. I mean, they don't care that my business is trashed by the hurricane. I have to be available. I have to have all kinds of equipment ready to go, stored somewhere where I can hook up and start filing claims, okay? So you need to kind of decide how you're going to handle your business. And I don't care whether you're a printing business, whether you're a hotel, you've got to decide how you're going to handle it. And most of us are pretty good about that. So you have to know what emergencies will exist in your business. You know, for me, it's the hardest thing is going to be to get people to come to one spot to work. But we have computers throughout, but will we have electricity? It's all those basic things. You have to understand, besides not only hurricanes and things hitting us, work accidents, physical perils, terrorism, these are COVID, these are all things that affect us that maybe we didn't plan for, but we should be thinking about them, especially now that COVID has hit. None of us ever thought about that. Okay, and we've seen what it's done to our businesses. Many of us are struggling. Many of us have relied upon the government to help out, and we're glad the government is helping out. Many have closed their doors. Okay, and it's those of us who own lots of property. We know that our land tenants, whether they're commercial tenants or personal tenants, are not paying their rent. We're going to have to try to get through it. So this is the types of emergencies. How do you handle this? So these are things you need to kind of think about before the emergency hits. 3 major areas of losses. Any type of loss is usually from damage to your business property. That's the biggest one, whether it's the fire or the hurricane or the flood. Your business property. Now you may not own the building, but you inside the building, you have all your computers. Maybe you're a manufacturer and you have equipment. Maybe you're a printer with all kinds of expensive printing machines. Whatever your business is, you have business personal property. That is your biggest concern if you don't own the building. Most businesses say, oh, my stuff's not worth much. It's not worth much until you lose it. And then all of a sudden you say, well, oh, I only said 50,000, it's really 100,000. Okay, you've got to be realistic. What would it cost to replace that equipment? I insured a printing business that had a pipe on the rented space in a high-rise concrete building downtown Honolulu. The pipe underneath was a water pipe that serviced the sprinkler system. For some reason, it decided to break right into the floor, their concrete floor, raised their floor up 8 inches, water all over to the tune of 24 inches, pouring out the front door. All their equipment damaged, all their paper damaged, okay? Fortunately, the building manager gave them another space to rent free. They moved what they could, got new equipment, got started up, but you don't understand that their business of over $250,000 worth of equipment was damaged. They had the correct amount of insurance, but they were also the kind of owners that said, Sue, we bought a new piece of equipment, increase our coverage. Whereas many clients don't bother to tell us what they're doing. And if you don't, then you're going to be underinsured. So you really need to like your insurance agent and talk to them so that they can insure you correctly. So your business personal property is very important, and you need to make sure it's insured correctly. If you have a slip and fall or someone gets hurt in your business, you've got the liability exposure. So you can't be running around with low limits. You have a business that's worth money. It's worth an asset. It's an asset that you have. You want to make sure that if somebody wants to sue you, the insurance company is going to be there to defend you. And if it truly is your fault, then you want to make sure that the insurance company is there to pay it. Look what just happened to Midpack on the child that drowned on a kayaking trip that we all read about in the newspaper. Okay, they had their umbrella policy there. Schools are a serious risk because you have so many young kids in there, and you have different teachers, and you have rules, but every now and then they get broken. And you've got to make sure that you have enough liability insurance. Don't just assume $500,000 or $1 million is enough. Look at what could really happen to you, because you know if the fire comes how much you've lost. You don't know when someone sues you how much you're going to lose. And you want to make sure that your carrier is there to protect you. Loss of income. Ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing worse for a business than not to have their income covered. You have a fire and you have to take 6 months to set up somewhere else, or you lose your customers, or you have just partial of your business. Loss of income is a serious thing for all business owners. That's what we're living on. We're planning on the business to continue, the income to come in. We're planning. So if something happens to your business that's insurable, COVID isn't, but if something is insurable, you want to make sure that that loss of income is covered. And it's only going to be covered to the amount you tell us to cover it. So if you say, oh, 100,000 is enough and it really isn't, whose fault is that, ladies and gentlemen? Please be realistic about your costs. Risk control techniques. I always tell people to assess the exposure to your property loss. I always hear, oh, I'm in a concrete building, nothing's going to happen to me. Okay, well, let me tell you about the floor that erupted and caused damage. Let me tell you about the fire. Or oh, I have a great one where the sprinkler system somehow broke, a rock got into it. We had, out of a 24-story building, we had 300 units damaged. So it happens, okay? You need to check your liability losses and what was your exposure to that. Misappropriation of funds. I cannot tell you how many claims I do file from trusted people taking money from the businesses. It happens. You give them the right to cut checks, you give them the right to sign. Sometimes you don't require a double signature, and then all of a sudden you feel something's a little off with your books, and sure enough, funds are missing. It happens. Do any of you cover that? That's another thing that most people just ignore, but it happens, and it happens often. And of course, your exposure to loss of income. So business insurance basically has several things that you buy. All people buy a property policy with liability. It's called a package. You can put the two together, save a little premium. If you have employees, you got to buy work comp, and you got to buy TDI, work comp for injuries on the job, TDI for injuries off the job. Okay, you've got to have those coverages if you have employees. Of course, you have health insurance too. You have to have an umbrella, or you should have an umbrella. This is just additional liability in case it hits the fan. Okay, you want to make sure that if something goes wrong and you get sued, you're not just relying on your package policy that maybe has $1 million, but that you have this additional umbrella policy that's giving you limits of 2, 3, 5, 10, 25, whatever number you feel you need. Okay, this is important, especially when deaths are involved in an accident in your building. Okay, you're going to need a huge umbrella. Your umbrella policy is also good because it's above your auto. So if you're out driving around and somebody jumps off the sidewalk and you hit them, or vice versa, you didn't see them and you hit them, your umbrella policy is there above your auto. And liability claims are not the type you can say you can quantify. You can say my building burns down, I've lost $1 million, or my business personal property is worth $500,000. It goes, but you don't know what that liability claim is going to bring. So I stress to people the need to have an umbrella. It's above your general liability policy. It's above your auto policy. It's above the liability on your workers' comp in case your employee decides to sue, as opposed to accepting the limits of the workers' comp policy. It is an excellent thing to have, and you need to consider it. Business interruption. You can't get COVID under business interruption. We all wish we could, But business interruption, because you have a peril that's covered and you no longer can run your business, it pays you for the fact that your business got interrupted. It gives you, okay, you were making $250,000 a month in receipts, and now you're down to 100 because you had to take a smaller space and your equipment's ruined. That difference can be covered by business interruption. Again, to the limits you choose. If you say, oh, I only need half of what I'm taking in, and then the loss comes and you say, well, I didn't have enough there. That's what you chose. So you need to be realistic about your limits. Bonding. Sometimes if you have people pay with cash a lot, or that can take cash, whether you're a store, whether you're a catamaran, whatever the case may be, when people use a lot of cash, you might want to have them bonded. If they're going into people's homes, they have a business like a cleaning service, you know, and things can be missing, you then need to worry about bonding. And it's something to consider. It's not a terribly expensive thing, but it is something that will help you should something go wrong, or you be accused of something going wrong with one of your employees. Some of us have environmental issues. We have storage tanks. We have, what do I want to say? Anyway, we have things that have gas or whatever the case may be that could ruin the environment. You will need to have some kind of environmental protection because your practice policy doesn't do it. And we do have people that have storage tanks with gas and things stored in it, and not just gas stations people. We have people who run generators. That's the word I'm trying to think of, generators. So you're going to need something to protect that. And then, of course, professional liability. For those of us who are professionals, okay, whether we're insurance agents, lawyers, whether we're doctors, whatever the case may be, we have a professional liability exposure. And of course, that is very important to have as well. So these are the main business insurances that everyone needs to consider. I could say, okay, I have no environmental issues. I'm not going to worry about that. I do have a bonding issue. I have all the other issues there. That's something that I would have to worry about, as most of you will have to worry about as well. So the disasters hit. Now what do you do? Okay. First thing you gotta do is protect your remaining property. That is standard operating procedure in insurance. The adjusters are going to expect you to protect it, not walk away from it, but to protect what's left, if there's anything left. Okay. You have to file your claim. So you have to hope to goodness that the adjusters, that your insurance agents are around and have electricity so you can file your claim. Okay. Assess your damage if you don't have insurance. In other words, if you say, well, I didn't carry fire insurance, okay, fine, and you have a fire. Now you've got to decide what are your losses, okay? And you've got, if you don't have insurance, then you know what, guys, it's out of your pocket because there's nothing else. You can't retroactivate any insurance to cover a claim that's already happened, okay? If you have the ability to borrow, you're going to be able to borrow, okay? But for many of us, when we've lost our home or our business, we don't have the ability to borrow. So, it's now hitting up friends and family, that type of situation. Government does give loans in time of catastrophes. So when the hurricane hits, you can get loans and relatively inexpensive. But again, that's another monkey on your back because you chose not to insure something that could have happened to your business. And that's fine if you're financially secure. But for those of you who aren't, you need to be sure that you're taking care of what to do before the disaster hits, because after doesn't look too good if you don't have insurance, okay? Lack of coverage, as I say, you got savings account. Oh yeah, right. After COVID, who's got savings accounts? You can borrow money, sell your property, or punt. See what you can do, come up with. It's amazing what can happen after a disaster and how people are creative, join in with other forces, whatever the case may be. But you basically have to rely on yourself. And sometimes it's just nicer to rely on insurance. In conclusion, basically, I want to tell you all, not having insurance after the disaster means relying on yourself. And there's no insurance policy that's going to go retroactive. Okay, I don't care. You can try, but it isn't going to happen. I've had people have auto accidents and call and say, we'd like to order auto. And then they try to file a claim. Well, you know what? The police report tells us the date it happened. It's not going to work, people. Okay. Look at your exposure before the disaster hits, and then make a decision how you want to handle the damage if it does hit. Okay, it is important that you understand what personal assets you have to cover a loss, your ability to secure a loan, or to sell the asset. Those are your options. Without insurance, I stress again to you the need to make sure you have business insurance for whatever needs your business have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sue. Thank you so much. I personally enjoyed your presentation. I learned a lot, and a lot about insurance, all the coverages that we need to get. And I'm so glad that I do have most of those for my house. And I hope everybody else does. I appreciate your presentation. And now we're going to go to King Anthony. Go ahead, Mr. Anthony.
Anthony. Oh,
Oh, boy.
so I'm trying to share, Sue. It says that you have to stop before I can start.
I have to stop.
All right.
Okay. Did I stop?
You did. Let me see if I can start. All right. Okay. Can somebody confirm that they can see my logo?
See it.
All right, cool. I actually, Sue, I have to admit, I added, while you were talking, I think I added 2 or 3 things to my own presentation. And I always enjoy presenting with you because you have just such an insane depth of knowledge. So I always appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Premier Restoration Hawaii, our mission statement, making a difference daily by restoring the lives of people, businesses, and communities of Hawaii. Share that with everybody because that's why we're here today. So, when BOMA had, asked us if we wanted to present, my gut always says, yes, I'll present on anything. I do not care what it is. I love to present and I love to help. But then my follow-up question is always, all right, what's the information that I can present to you that is going to be of value? And so I take off my president of Premier Restoration hat and I put on my what if I'm a building manager hat, and I start thinking about things through the lens of disaster preparedness. And so it leads me to this, like how building managers should prepare for any disaster. I apologize in advance, Mr. Benjamin Oates, for the picture of your former building up there. But that's it. In the grand scheme of things, the Marco Polo fire is a good case study for what can happen when there is a widespread disaster. And so when I'm thinking about things, this is the context under which I'm thinking. I'm also thinking about, hurricanes, windstorms, tsunamis, those types of events. And then in our world, sometimes the disastrous event is not necessarily a weather-related event or something global, but something specific to the building, such as a catastrophic mechanical failure, large fires, those types of things. And, they may not affect multiple properties, but they greatly impact that one building. So I wish that we had everybody's screens on because this would be fun to do. But my questions to everybody who's a building manager in attendance today is, do you have a plan? And I would guess that some people in this room probably do have a plan. And then my next question is usually, do you know where it is? And usually a few more hands go down because some people know they have a plan, but some people may not know exactly where it is. And then, the final question being, does it accomplish the goal of being truly prepared? And I think for a lot of us, that speaks to how we feel about the plan we have in hand. And so through my mind, disaster preparedness looks like one of these 2 things. Either number one, it is this fat binder that you have sitting on a shelf that has a ton of information in it that you put together at one point because somebody said, hey, we should do this, and it's a great idea. Very likely it's been a long time since you've revisited that plan and elements of the building have changed or need to be updated. But usually the plan that sits on the shelf was good when it was created, if you know where it is, but may be outdated. Now, most buildings that I've run into or I work with have a disaster restoration plan that is oriented around a person. There's usually one individual who knows that building very, very well. And hopefully that individual happens to be on island when the event occurs and their cell phone battery is charged and they are answering it. Otherwise, you're kind of in a dark place where you don't have all the information you need to reply. And this is from my perspective. I've actually participated in a lot of disaster planning scenarios with be it either the states. We did a lot with civil defense here locally on Maui for a period of time. A number of facilities, be it shopping malls or condo associations, we've been a part of their development of disaster plans because, like I said, I'm kind of the guy that is always willing to jump in and help in any way I can. So if you invite me to your disaster planning meeting, I'll probably show up. And so this is just my perspective. So advantages of having a comprehensive disaster plan is the fact that it is comprehensive. A lot of the disaster plan and planning tools that exist out there are almost exhaustively comprehensive. They cover everything from hurricane to tsunami to hail to kind of any event that you can think of that can go wrong. I remember we participated in one disaster planning session where the building had functional fountains and they had a Legionella preparedness plan in case there was a Legionella outbreak because they had water features on property. It does give you a documented plan. It does give you a point of reference that you can go to and access if you need it. And it creates a plan for all those potential risks. Now, from my perspective, the disadvantages of having a comprehensive disaster plan, a lot of the times these take a long time to complete. In one scenario that sticks out in my mind, it took us almost 2 years of meeting for 90 minutes a week to assemble this disaster plan because it was so comprehensive. They may be too comprehensive. I feel like sometimes in a disaster situation, there's a lot of triage that goes on and it becomes very difficult to assume all the bad things that could potentially happen for each of these events. And then lastly, and I've alluded to this, everything that goes in a binder that sits on a shelf and only one person knows where that binder is. So if that person happens to be gone fishing for the day, a lot of the times you're back to the shotgun approach of disaster planning, which means you're trying to figure it out with the resources you have. So is disaster planning worth it? And this is a question that I get asked as well. And my answer is always yes. But rather than encouraging building managers who have never put together a disaster plan to start with a super comprehensive disaster plan, my advice is always to start small. Because something, and when it comes to disaster planning, something is always better than having nothing. Fortunately, there is a ton of resources available out there. One of the greatest resources there is obviously the BOMA publication. I actually have this, and it's something that I look at whenever somebody mentions the word disaster preparedness. IREM also has a disaster preparedness before and after disaster strikes. There's ready.gov, which is a little bit more oriented towards the average everyday consumer. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, which is kind of a branch of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they have an incredible resource page with a bunch of different links on disaster preparedness. And then Hawaiian Electric has a pretty solid, kind of with a local twist, emergency preparedness manual. And so if you're trying to make the decision as to whether or not to put together a plan and you decide you want to put together a plan because you don't have one, I would definitely rely on these 5 resources as a reference guide, but try and encourage you to keep it simple. I jumped the slide. So what would Anthony do? I would tell you, yes, you should have a plan. I would tell you, keep it simple, because the simpler it is, the greater the likelihood that it'll be used. Make sure that it is accessible to everyone. This is a great tool that should be visible. It should not be on a bookcase behind a desk, but it should be out in the open for everybody to be able to use. And it should focus on the greatest exposures, the greatest risks that your particular building may be subject to. If your building is within proximity of the shoreline and in the tsunami warning zone, then yeah, you're probably going to want to have a plan for tsunamis. But if your building is in Mililani, that may not be a concern for you. And you may decide, you know what, we're not going to do tsunami, but we are going to do hurricane and we are going to do this. So then that way we can be prepared. So if you're looking for what to assess, which is always a dark path to go down, here's a list: hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, large fires, and large mechanical failures. I put both of those on there because outside of the normal, I hate to call any fire normal, but there's fires that are grossly catastrophic in nature that affect an entire building, and then there are fires that are not. So I would focus on the fires that are grossly catastrophic, as well as the mechanical failures. We had an instance where some mechanical equipment was on the roof and it leaked and affected a great number of units. So those types of scenarios. Disease outbreaks, I talked about, the individual that I worked with that actually had a Legionella exposure built into their disaster plan. Any active shooter drills, it's a reality in our world today. I think it's one that we don't take seriously enough or consider. Rioting has also become more prevalent, and kind of anything that is specific to your building and your location. And so I would encourage you to think about all the facilities that exist around you, because they may or may not directly impact what risks you choose to evaluate. So my solution, and this is kind of where I advise everybody to start, define which risks you want to evaluate and come up with a plan for, and create a one-page checklist for each of those risks. So if you decide collectively that you're going to evaluate hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and large fire, then you will have a four-page disaster plan with a checklist for each of those. I'm a big fan of putting things on one page for some reason. I feel like if it's on one page, most everybody will read it. But if it's 80 pages in a binder, it's probably not going to get looked at too frequently. And so my next piece of advice is, don't make this one person's job. Set aside the time to develop this with a building facilities team, because those individuals are going to have great ideas for what should go on the checklist. And then I would also encourage everybody cross-reference with all the other guides that I referenced, the BOMA publication, the IRM publication. There's a lot of pre-populated checklists and information contained within those documents that you can reference and pull from to create your own checklist. And the checklist should be a list of actions. Like in the event of a hurricane, base them on time, like 24 hours before, 4 hours before, or, things that should be done immediately following an event, within the first 24 hours, within the first 48 hours. And then make sure that they're assigned to, I'm a big fan of specific roles, because people change in the building environment. But if you're a small enough building, you can assign them to individuals as well. And then the key thing I would make sure is to pull them out, make them a part of a facilities meeting annually, and review them. And just simply put them up on the board and walk through them one at a time. Because I wanted to go ahead and give an example of one of these that we walked through. This particular one is for a hurricane, and it's for a small to mid-size condominium complex with, call it, I think they were between 150 and 200 units, so not a monster place. Had a small in-house building operations team of 5. They did outsource a ton of services like lawn care and that kind of stuff. So they had a very, very small in-house team. And this was the list that we came up with that fit all on one page. I couldn't fit it all on one slide, so we'll go through it real quick. So 24 hours before landfall, they had a few things they wanted to make sure that they were advising their building occupants of. Whether or not they were going to close the building, that was a consideration. They wanted to remind their building occupants to remove any items adjacent to windows, away from windows, and to remove all the lanai furniture and fixtures, just get them inside. Unplug any sensitive electronics. And this particular building had a subterranean parking garage, and they were going to have everybody, they were like kind of half vacation rental. And so anybody who was a resident that kept their car on the ground floor, they were going to tell them, hey, move it above ground, just in case the pumps in the subterranean parking garage go out. Next, test any building security measures that you intend on utilizing during the hurricane. They had some building systems that they were going to rely upon for communications, so they wanted to make sure they double check those. Double check any roof mounted mechanical systems and ensure that they're secured and or cover if necessary. So this particular building had a ton of mechanical equipment on the roof. They had an event previously where one of their mechanical systems, the mounting brackets, had rusted through and it was simply sitting loose on the roof. So this was something that was very sensitive to them. Remove and secure any outdoor furniture or any other items that are not permanently secured. They had a pool, so their plan was to go and collect all the pool furniture and bring it inside. Back up any data off-site. So they maintained most of their data on site, but they did have a process weekly where they backed up off site. So in the event of a hurricane, they would go ahead and make sure that they backed up that data off site. Ensure any storm and roof drains are clear of any debris. They actually had a flooding event previously that was caused by heavy rains where the storm drains were clogged. They got a bunch of big trees on property that clogged up the drains. And then they were going to test their backup communication systems. They had a building intercom system that they were planning on using, as well as two-way radios, like a simple two-way radio system. And then they had a couple vulnerable entrances that they were going to place sandbags on to prevent flooding from getting into the building. 4 hours before landfall, they were going to de-energize any non-critical building systems. So simply put, anything that they could unplug or flip a breaker on that wouldn't be a life safety issue, they were going to go ahead and de-energize it. They were going to turn off water supply to a few areas of the property, but if my memory serves me correctly, they were going to leave water supply to the residential units. They're going to send any non-essential staff home. If anybody happened to be on property that didn't need to be there, they were going to get them out of there. They were going to secure the building. For them, this meant everything except the main entrance. They were going to go ahead and secure. So then that way, during the event, they only had one point of ingress and egress. Monitor the news, get indoors and stay indoors, retest their communication systems. And then they had 10 or 15, they identified them as high risk building occupants, folks who are elderly, someone who's disabled. This particular building really wanted to make sure that those individuals who couldn't prepare for themselves, they were going to go and pull that lanai furniture off the lanai for them and just make sure they were good 4 hours before. During the event, real simple. They had designated locations for everybody that they were going to stand by in. And so they were going to the designated locations. They were going to perform location checks with the assigned staff every 15 minutes, just a quick key up on the radio to make sure everybody's okay. And just stay tuned in, waiting for the all clear to be sounded. After the all clear was sounded, they're going to go inspect all the building systems. For them, they were very concerned about damage to the building systems because most of them were roof mounted or exterior, and go ahead and re-energize those systems that they turned off and ensure that they started back up and functioned well. Power, they were going to turn off some power, some water. Some of the entrance systems, they were going to inspect the fire alarms to make sure that they were up. They actually had a redundancy program in case the fire alarm system wasn't up for a fire watch. Elevators, mechanical systems. They will also inspect the building envelope for any signs of physical damage and document with photos. If half the roof had peeled off, they were going to take a picture of that. Board up any broken windows or other building penetrations. Mitigate any water damage sustained to prevent mold growth, and then file any insurance claims for resulting damage. So that is the example checklist that we developed for a hurricane. You can imagine if you take every single exposure and all you do is start to assemble a quick one-page checklist, how impactful that will be in the event that you have something going on. And from my perspective, I look at this as a strategy towards building a much bigger, more comprehensive disaster plan. But if you never get there, at least you have this. I think sometimes disaster planning kind of gets shrouded in this illusion of being so complex and overly comprehensive. And a lot of the times the reasons why we're assembling these disaster plans are because somebody told us we needed to, not because we've identified that this is something we needed to do, or we're not driving the value we need out of it as building operations folks. So yeah. For us at Premier Restoration, I can't overly emphasize the fact of how dedicated we are to our communities. And there's been a couple of things that have happened recently that have made me smile. One of them being the video on the top right is some of our guys out on the North Shore just this past wet season saw a stream that was looking like it was going to overflow, and so they stopped with a bunch of local residents and just helped clear all the debris out. So then that way, if it rained again, nothing was going to get flooded. I'll go ahead and make sure that BOMA has this, but this is just kind of a collection of resources that I look at often when we're talking about disaster preparedness. The BOMA Emergency Preparedness Guidebook, the IREM publication, HECO's handbook, the U.S. Chamber Foundation, and the ready.gov site are all very, very good. And look at it from a business perspective, not necessarily just the individual perspective of making sure you have all the water and the food that you need. I think we're in Hawaii, we're all dialed in on that, and we have those redundancies in place. It's always the impacts to our business that I think we overlook. So with that, that is what I had to share today. We wanted to make sure that we left some time available for everybody to ask questions. And I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony, and I really appreciate your presentation. And again, I personally learned a lot, and I am kind of like you. I'm a keep it simple kind of person, and I really love the one-page checklist. A great idea, and I certainly don't want to read many pages of instructions. And even if I do, I'm not going to remember them anyway. So good job. I really like that. So with that, I'm going to just go to the questions that we have on the screen. I think the first one is for Sue. It says that if a building is not in a registered floodplain, can the building still get flood insurance? You might want to unmute yourself. Sorry, Sue.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes, you can get flood insurance even if you're not in a mandated flood zone.
Okay, well, that was short and straight to the point. Thank you so much. Okay, so I do have a quick question for Anthony myself.
Yeah.
We were in a situation in a real life, and we did have water damage, and our residents were concerned about the mold afterwards appearing. And at the time, I didn't have the knowledge, and I didn't know how long a period we have before the actually mold starts appearing in the places and crevices and all that. So what is a period of time that you have to actually take actions before the mold starts appearing?
For sure. And a lot of this is very subjective to building history. So if it's an older building that has had previous events that have leaked, the possibility that mold will appear and grow is likely, and it will occur faster. Whereas if it's a newer structure, or there hasn't, nobody's occupied it, or there's low occupancy, then the possibility of mold growing quickly is a lot less likely. So we evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. The textbook answer to your question is about 48 hours. Mold can start growing as soon as about 48 hours. But an individual from our industry, this was 2005, did a study where he built mock wall assemblies with 2x4s, drywall, standard building materials, got them wet, encased them in like plexiglass style enclosures, and just left them sit and analyzed them every day. And the first mold spore he saw grow was at 19 days. So
Oh,
in
wow.
that environment, it took 19 days, but those were brand new building materials that didn't have a history of any water damage.
Wow.
And they weren't in Hawaii. So those
Oh,
are
yeah.
some complications.
True. Hawaii is, the environment is always damp and you have a lot of moisture in the air. And that I understand totally what you're talking about. Let me see if we have any other questions here. Not that I see of. So I think we're good on this. And when I was attending college, my professor used to say, if there aren't any questions, the professor or the speaker has done either a really great job or has totally confused the audience. So, so I don't think this is the case that you have confused the audience. I think your presentations were great and clear. So I think that's the reason why we don't have any, questions. And I really appreciate both of you presenting. And again, your experiences and knowledge are valuable, and I'm sure. And I took a couple of pointers, take away stuff. I'm sure everybody else did as well. I'm just gonna, in closing, I'm just gonna go over some other things that I need to do. I have to announce our next BOMA meeting, which is gonna happen on May 12th, next month at 11 o'clock. Okay, I'm gonna stress that it is at 11, not 12. We normally have it at 12, but this one is gonna be at 11 on May 12th. So don't get the numbers mixed up. May 12th at 11. Okay, so the topic of that is streamlining your process, tips on permitting processes. So this is a talk story with Dean Yoshida, Director of Department of Planning and Permitting, and Darren Lee, Principal at Palikana Permits. So be on the lookout for the buzz email from BOMA Hawaii. And I certainly want to know what the new person has to say about the permitting department, as far as the streamlining the processes and all that. And that's basically it for that. And at the end, I would like to thank everybody who attended, especially our guest speakers, Anthony and Sue. A special thanks to Lily and Arlena from HPPA for your tireless, limitless support for BOMA Hawaii, and valuable contributions. I can't thank you enough. You guys are awesome. Other than that, I think aloha to everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Good to see everyone, and take care. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.